Okay, so I understand we've had a lot of discussions on carbon so far, but today I'm going to be focusing on biodiversity and nature. So just a quick hands up, how many of you in this room are aware of biodiversity credits or know a little bit about biodiversity credits? Okay, that's absolutely fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to go for an intro, a few slides or introducing the concept of biodiversity credits and nature credits, what they are, how they're different to carbon, how there's different types of compliance and voluntary markets. And then I'm going to go into an example of a pilot project that me and my team have been working on in Indonesia, which is looking at quite large scale nature restoration, focusing on the voluntary biodiversity credits. So first of all, I just want to set the scene. So we've got COP29 happening right now. A few weeks ago, we had COP16 in Cali, which is the one that focuses on primarily biodiversity and nature. Unfortunately, not much came out of that was too positive, and that conversation's rolled over into this current COP alongside climate. And I think now most scientists agree that we aren't going to overcome the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis just focusing on carbon. So if we focus on biodiversity, if we focus on nature, not only can we sequester a lot of that carbon out of our atmosphere, but we can have a multitude of profound benefits to societies, to the economy, and many other things as well, okay? So just want to set the scene with this. We need $700 billion a year to halt ecosystem and species loss. That's just to prevent any further ecosystem loss. That's not even to restore the planet. And currently, we only have about $35 billion per year committed to. So I believe this target reaches up to 2030. We need over $600 billion a year to reach this target. Now, most of that will need to come from governments, but actually what I'm going to talk about is how both governments and businesses can use nature markets and biodiversity credits and these things to try and overcome some of this burden. And this is largely because 55% of the world's GDP is highly dependent on nature, and a lot more of that is still dependent on nature. It's just not highly dependent on nature. So nature markets are starting to emerge. I think everyone's kind of familiar with carbon markets and loosely how they work, and there's many obvious issues that have occurred with carbon markets in the past. As nature markets are emerging, the biodiversity specialists, ecologists like me, and then financial experts are keen to prevent those issues from reoccurring. But nature is seen as the latest paradigm in ESG. Okay, so what I just wanted to illustrate here is, can we drive nature conservation and restoration through market-driven incentives? So we live in a capitalist society. More often than not, you know, we see the issues with, even with the COP events, right, and the struggles to reach, you know, what's looking even difficult now, the 2 degrees of warming. At times it's quite depressing. So can we utilize the economic systems we're in to overcome this issue? Can we incentivize people to overcome these issues? And more often than not, that means making a profit. So is there a way to make a profit on nature that actually invests in nature and brings back all of the things that we need? So in the past, we took nature for granted. And we saw it as a resource. We just extract that resource to make profit. But actually what we forgot about was to account for all of the things that nature actually provides us. Flood protection, air pollution removal, and so on. And the key thing that underpins most of these ecosystem services is biodiversity. It's all the animal life, the plant life, the fungi, the bacteria. Everything that we take for granted really stems from these dynamic processes. And so nature markets attempts to overcome this, okay? And there's a few sort of drivers from this at the moment. There's frameworks like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, which is encouraging businesses to not just look at profit making in the short term, but the long term. If climate and biodiversity crisis hit, is your business going to be hit? If so, invest now. So that's this illustration here. And WEF prediction is that actually with these processes, there'll be a demand of $180 billion per year into nature markets by 2050. But what are biodiversity and nature credits? So this description here is from the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. So it's a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would otherwise occur. So you can see from the diagram here, this typically equates to an outcome or an activity over so many years for a particular time period, okay? But as you'll see very soon, biodiversity is not as simple as one single variable like carbon. So carbon, for example, if we take 1 ton of carbon in, say, a forest in China and compare it to 1 ton of carbon in a mangrove in Indonesia, that variable is, it's comparable. Biodiversity is not comparable. The biodiversity in those two locations be wildly different, and the dynamics and the processes they go through are also wildly different. So we need to consider all of these things. So how do we do that? Okay, so at the moment, what you'll find is there are many different organizations out there trying to, beat the rush and develop these methodologies and approaches to get to market first so that we can have this nature market. But because nature is so complex, it comes with many different issues. And that basically means that many different companies are focusing on different approaches. And if you have time and are interested in this topic, this Substack by Bloom Labs is a really great place to start. So this just shows sort of the different types of organizations and the approaches they're taking. So you have some that are focusing just on single species conservation, others focusing on ecosystem restoration, some on completely other things, and some a mishmash of each other. And so when you're considering this type of approach, there's so many things you need to consider. Is it terrestrial or marine environment? Are you going to measure an outcome or practice-based? Is it for offsetting, which is quite controversial when it comes to biodiversity? And actually the consensus at the moment is that offsetting should not be allowed. Biodiversity credits should be allowed for contribution claims only. But we'll see how that plays out, because sometimes the market has different ideas. And then we have other things like, are you can consider absolute or relative uplift? And there's all these like very technical things that you need to worry about. But the key thing I want to ask today is, how do you balance biodiversity with other ecosystem services and the uplift of all of those, okay? Because if you're looking at a single species, can you guarantee that you're having this holistic effect? And you need to have a holistic effect if you're going to overcome the biodiversity crisis, right? So there's different types of biodiversity credits. What we're seeing in the markets at the moment is they're sort of coalescing and converging around this concept of ecosystem condition. And I'll introduce this later and explain what it means, okay? But you can see again from this Bloom Labs entry here, there's people focusing on species, ecosystem condition, and then other as well. So that's a very short introduction to the concept of biodiversity credits and nature credits. I now want to like kind of contextualize it with a project that I've been working on myself. And this is with an organization called Napital in collaboration with the organization I work for, AECOM. And this is a project that we're piloting in Bintan, so not too far from here. So the ecology in this location is very similar to what we have in Singapore. So me and my team are very familiar with the species and how the ecological dynamics work. And instead of just focusing on one species or just looking at biodiversity, we have decided to look at 5 different ecosystem services. And this, we believe, is a way to measure holistically uplift in ecosystem condition, okay? And I'll come back to that in a moment. So the Natural Capital Initiative, which is from Napital, is pioneering a strategy that merges conservation, digital, and AI technologies and financial incentives to restore ecosystems. So I'm not going to go into the financial aspects of this project. I'm going to go into the technical stuff, because I think actually there's quite a lot of lessons and things that people can learn about how difficult this actually can be, given the complexities, okay? So the 5 that we're looking at is biodiversity, soil quality, water quality, carbon, and air quality. So we are still looking at carbon here, but we're looking at the sort of the overall picture of nature. So our site is down here. It's an 800 hectare site in Bintan, so very close to Singapore. And our pilot is focusing on restoring 100 hectares of this 800 hectare site. And this is what it looks like. This is what some of the good parts of it look like anyway, okay? So you have this huge Buddhist monastery in the Bintan countryside, and then you have this huge mountain range known as Gunung Kijang, and then most of it is still forested. Okay, so you see this, it looks quite good, right? You think, why do we need to come to this site and restore this site? And just to sort of illustrate what we're going to do and what we have started to do, this is the process that we're taking, right? So first of all, we identified an area of land. Then we've gone through and we started to baseline and project those, potential uplifts, like how far can we actually go with this, what's possible, because we need to know this to be able to create biodiversity credits. And then develop a strategy around, the habitat restoration. What do we need to do to restore the site? And then over time, we can monitor and display, and over time actually track that performance. And then from that approach, we can then link the release of biodiversity credits. So this is our site, and this is a nice image of our site. So you can see here, there are some degraded areas that are very obviously degraded, and you can see it looks like the soil has been completely degraded in there. And I'll show you some more examples of this in a moment. And then on the right-hand side, it kind of goes back to what I just showed you, that some of the forests from above, from drone footage, from aerial imagery, from just by the roadside, looks really good. But that doesn't tell the full story, because when me and my team went to the site, what we actually found is, yes, there's these huge areas where you get these very obviously red soils where they've removed all the trees in the topsoil, which is going to be in reality really difficult to get habitat restoration to reoccur without significant intervention. But you look at the picture on the left-hand side there. So this was on top of one of those mountain tops that you just saw. Okay, so when me and my team were there, we were walking around with the local headman and the villagers, and we found out that they had been logging the underneath of the forest, preventing succession of this forest to like a really mature state, which is really good for biodiversity. What we also found was very little animal life. And there's good records that quite a lot of illegal hunting happens, or like kind of bush hunting happens in this part of Indonesia. So very quickly, when I was speaking to my colleagues in Hong Kong, we first initiated this project. They thought, oh, we can just plant some trees, it'll be easy. And then I very quickly told them after day one of being on site, the only way we're going to get this to work is if we work with the locals and get them to safeguard the habitat rather than degrade the habitat. So it comes back to the point that lots of people are talking at in the COP events around indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is just across the water over there in Bintan. So I think sometimes in our cities, we get a little bit detracted from this concept. And this was a real eye-opener for us. So this is, after we did our surveys, our initial surveys, we did a big habitat map, and just very quickly from the map you can see, the gradation of the color from light to dark goes from basically degraded or lower successional stages up to mature forest. So the areas where it's dark green, which are largely around the hills or where it's less degraded or in a sort of a mature state, and then the bright green areas are more of the degraded areas. So you can see very quickly that there is a lot of space to do restoration in this area. And you can see some of the areas are so heavily degraded from bauxite mining and soil extraction, because this type of orange soil is good for aluminium, that this is going to be really tough. So what we did is we ground truthed all the different habitat types and tried to understand how the habitats were sort of recolonizing to understand how we could get restoration to work. So just really quickly, these are the sorts of different stages of mature growth that we saw. In its best state, we saw like A over here, and you can just kind of see some very mature trees in there, but basically we found out from the locals that in the 90s, people were coming from Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia to extract hardwoods for furniture. So actually a lot of this is regrowth from about 30 years, 40 years. And actually there are some big trees there, but it's the undergrowth which is preventing that really good biodiverse habitat. And then as you go down, you can see that it becomes much more jungly, much more scrubby, and hard to get through, and that's because it's much younger growth. And then we go down the chain, and then we get our scrubby sort of grasslandy habitats. And there's a real range of these, from really interesting ones with pitcher plants, which are carnivorous plants, to beds of ferns and other things as well. And we were trying to really understand the successional stages on this site, so we could build up that restoration plan, understand how we could do it. But coming back to the concept of ecosystem condition, okay, and this is going to get a little bit technical, try and keep it high level, but I just want to kind of illustrate this concept. So the concept of ecosystem condition effectively acts as a measurement of ecosystem health. So think about resilience, okay? So when we talk about nature-based solutions, if we can create really dynamic habitats or ecosystems, they're going to be more resilient to climate change, more resilient to big storms, and they're going to provide us all those ecosystem services that we really want. And so the fundamental concepts of this focus on composition, which is about species. Do you have good species mix on your site? Do you have good structure? Is it connected across the landscape, or is it actually within your forest? Going back to your forest types here, does it have really good three-dimensional structures which are good for animals living in a canopy and so on, right? And then the last one is function, which focuses on the quality of ecosystem services. So if we measure all of these, we can have a really good holistic effect, a measurement process. And so this comes from TNFD, UN, lots of people are coalescing around this concept now. So if you're interested, go and understand this concept, because I think we'll hear a lot more about it. So just to illustrate, I have an example here of a mangrove. So this would be like a high condition mangrove, really nice, pristine mangrove. And then the flip side would be a low condition, highly degraded mangrove. And you can see, differences in species, difference in structure, and so on, okay? So that's just a really simple sort of example. And then what we do from that is we start to then work out how we're gonna measure all of these things. So for biodiversity, we have an example I'll give you in a moment. Ecosystem services, we are obviously quite simple because we're looking at single variables. So we focus on a couple of these variables here. But coming back to biodiversity, there's a number of things we can do to do this in a simple way. Because if we sent out ecologists, we'd be there all day, every day, measuring everything because there's so many things you can look at. So we need to use technology to keep the cost down so we can get the investment and make this work. So we use things like environmental DNA, which can basically meta barcode and work out using soil samples or water samples what species are in your environment. And you can kind of use that as a proxy for biodiversity value. Same goes for bioacoustics. You can collect ambient noise and compare and contrast it to reference sites and work out how good your site is, just based on ambient noise. You don't even need to identify the species in it. So, and this all uses AI and interesting technology. And then things like camera traps, which can, again, we're using AI to try and identify the species very quickly to reduce the manpower effort and make this a really sort of investable product. And so then once you get the data from all of these, we can then throw this into an index, and then that's when we'll get an overall value for each of those parcels you see on the site, and we can then start to release credits associated with these over certain time periods. So well, at least once we've shown uplift in biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the key sort of focus around biodiversity, and there's lots of interesting things around this now. So one thing I haven't mentioned actually is that this is a sort of a product for the voluntary biodiversity and nature credit market. But actually there's many countries around the world focusing on the compliance market. So the UK, Australia are the ones leading the way at the moment, and I've been involved in the one in the UK previously. And we use metrics like this, which is like a biodiversity accounting metric, which uses like extensive data sets to drive values. And what we can do is adapt this with the measurement techniques that I've just shown you, using reference sites to really have a fairly accurate way of discerning sort of uplift in biodiversity. So this is very simplistic to look at. I mean, it just shows some numbers, but the essence is that we are converting the complexity of nature and biodiversity into some very simple numerical data, which the average person can understand, which can then be understood by financial markets as well. And then just to wrap up, that's the kind of the overarching sort of approach in a very high level way. There's a lot more to it than that, but just coming back to the way that we collect the data, you can see that, we did walkover surveys and we do traditional transects and things, and we collect data on like these species you can see on the left-hand side here. But we also use camera traps and the bioacoustic devices and so on to collect additional data. And you can see here on the camera traps that we left out, we found a mouse deer, which you can also find in Singapore. And then on your bioacoustics, this is kind of how it looks. So you have your sort of sonograph here. And if we really wanted to, we can go through and identify these species based on their calls. So we set our devices which can record noise at night, it can record noise during the day, and it can pick up, amphibians, birds, bats, even ambient noise from crickets and other insects. And we can either identify the individual species or we can use in that sort of proxy AI measurement and track change over time. And there's loads of good research papers that show how to do this now. And then just showing the soil biota eDNA as well. So this is your environmental DNA. We can look at all of the species in the soil and start to build up a picture of that as well. So, traditionally in ecology and this type of work, we'd focus on the above ground stuff. But if we're going to get restoration to work in a really good way, we need to look below ground as well. Not just at carbon, but also the animals and the organisms living under there. So that's all I wanted to share today. This is a pilot, so this is very much trying to work out how we're going to get this to work. And it's a fairly pioneering approach. Many Western companies are applying this, mainly within Europe and North America and Australia. I believe this is the first time this is being done in Asia by an Asian company. So we're really excited, and any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you, Welch. So as usual, you can scan the QR code to send your questions to Mentimeter, or if you have any questions in the audience, I'm happy to. Okay, so let's start there.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. One question, so this, you hinted at it, but there's a metric of species richness. How do you account for it for a tropical biome versus a tundra or temperate where you might have just 2 species in the whole place? So how do you account for that?
So this is where we have to be quite careful, right? Because we don't want to be trading biodiversity credits from one location with another location, right? So this is where the financial markets play a role in terms of like ensuring that we're not allowing this to happen, because it could get way more dangerous than carbon credits if we're allowing an Antarctic biodiversity. Someone's destroying stuff in Antarctica, but then offsetting it with a credit from Indonesia is ethically not right, let alone ecologically right. So there are ways, and I think like the key thing, like there's a drive at the moment to standardize these metrics, if you like. And this is not just in the biodiversity credit space, but also like the way that corporates will run metrics to understand their impacts and dependencies. And what they do is they are trying to focus more on like systems rather than individual species. So for example, I didn't give this example earlier, but if you decided like there's some approaches out there that focus on like they call it a basket of metrics approach. You select any 5 things that you want to look at in an environment. So you could pick birds, for example. Okay, but I could have 2 plots of land and I'm assessing the birds on both of those. And you could just get random spikes in populations because of migration changes and stuff that's happening off your site. But does that mean actually the intervention you're doing on your site is actually working? It doesn't really, not necessarily, right? So I think we need to move away from the fixation of species and use more of these sort of general approaches which look at sort of just uplift in general. If we can do that whilst not getting fixated, obviously the biodiversity important in terms of understanding how we can restore this particular forest, right? But that's the approach we're advocating to use. So it's a difficult one to answer, and you would never really want to compare species richness of one place to another. Even within one country, comparing species richness between 2 different habitat types can be a little bit tricky to do. Okay, so I have another question here. It says, since we are converting an ecosystem into something quantifiable and simple enough to be digested by financial markets, how do we prevent a loss of essential detail oversimplification? This is the golden question, really. This is the holy grail. And you can see a lot of work is sort of going into this project at the moment. What I'm scared of is that people come to market with very basic approaches, and it completely sort of just ruins it for everybody else trying to do a good job. And actually that would mean we wouldn't get the outcomes we need to achieve those targets that I showed you at the beginning. So so basically what we need to do is we need to do all the detail in the background related to like standards in the way that basically the ecologists are talking about how it should be done, how science shows it should be done, whilst then converting that into numerical data which financial markets can easily use. What we don't want to do is just do very simple stuff, give them that data, and like the bird example is the one I just gave, where if that doesn't necessarily mean true uplift. So we do need to be very careful.
Do we have another question? Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I understand that it takes a lot of effort to map all this complexity, and I see that this was a relatively small project. So how are you seeing the development, maybe through technology, through remote sensing, through IoT devices and so on, to scale this effort to big natural-based solution projects?
Yeah, so because this is relatively small given this is a pilot, so we're trying to test all these things out before we scale it up. It's getting that balance right between the effort versus the cost involved, and it's really tough. So we're exploring all these options now, so the bioacoustics and so on, so that we know that we can just send people out, set these devices up, they can send the data to whoever, get AI to assess it, then we can ground truth it, And then that basically reduces the manpower needed and the cost associated with it, so that we can actually get, because like one of the fundamental problems with ecological work is it can be very costly. And it puts people off, particularly private businesses. So there is a fine line that we need to get right. If it becomes too costly, then this is, you know, untenable to work, basically. So yeah, it's about finding the balance between using the technology and traditional methods and making sure that, actually also another thing is consistent approach. You need a consistently applied approach, and it needs to be scientific, right? So we can't just go out and do things in a subjective manner and then, you know, say that we're getting uplift and release credits from that. It's not going to work. So actually, in a way, these mechanisms actually can help standardize and also reduce human bias, right? Because ecologists also have biases. We have preferences and likes for different species, and our eyes will be better at picking up certain things than others. So actually, I think the technology has an advantage in some ways. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ash.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Pierre, as well, for inviting me. So I'm David Taylor. I'm the Department of Geography at NUS. I'm going to talk to you about nature-based carbon sinks. They've received a lot of attention over the last few years because of their potential role in achieving net zero emissions, but also because of their potential role in highly lucrative carbon markets, or what could be highly lucrative carbon markets. Of course, these nature-based carbon sinks, which are forests, mangroves, seagrass meadows, peatlands, agricultural soils, and the like, have multiple functions beyond simply being places where carbon is captured and sequestrated. And those multifunctions are often overlooked. So I want to do, for 20 minutes or so, is talk to you about two issues relating to the governance of nature-based carbon sinks. One of those is the scale of governance. The other is whether there are alternative sources of funding to the market. So non-market, I know it's going to cause a bit of controversy here, but non-market based sources of finance. Okay, just some context. I think it's worthwhile reminding us why we're here, why there is this interest in nature-based carbon sinks and other ways of achieving net zero, and that's the relentless rise of carbon emissions. This triggered a report, of course, about 6 years ago by the IPCC, which highlighted the dangers of rising carbon dioxide levels, rising carbon in the atmosphere, dangerous climate change of greater than 1.5 degrees C above the global mean, et cetera, and the likely impacts of that. And I think it's worthwhile pointing out that this relentless rise in emissions has been despite the attention of the global community and attempts to, through various agreements, to try and curb emissions. So this relentless rise began, of course, in the 1950s. The first IPCC report was released in 1990. I was a junior lecturer at the time with interest in tropical climate change. I was really enthused by the release of the IPCC's first report because it made predictions about the likely consequences of rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And their projections have turned out to be incredibly accurate. So back in the early 1990s, the IPCC report came out and projected that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere would be around 415 parts per million now. And that would result in a global mean surface temperature increase of around 1 degree C higher than pre-industrial levels. So the scientists have got it right, and they've continuously got it right over the last 30 years or so. It's the policymakers where things have come unstuck. I think it's also worth pointing out that the first carbon markets were introduced in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and they have done nothing to limit rising CO2 concentration levels. So that rising emissions of carbon, largely from the burning of fossil fuels, has to go somewhere. And it generally ends up in our atmosphere, the atmospheric carbon sink, where it causes global warming. It has also, over the years, ended up in the ocean sink as well, where it causes ocean acidification. Only relatively small amounts of carbon emissions over the last few centuries have actually ended up in the terrestrial carbon sink. But it's now widely recognized that in order to stave off dangerous climate change, we have to achieve net zero emissions by the middle of this century, and the best way to do that is by a combination of cutting emissions and increased carbon sequestration by that terrestrial carbon sink. Cutting emissions, the main way of doing it, enhancing carbon sequestration in that terrestrial carbon sink. I would also argue that enhancing carbon sequestration is not the same as avoiding deforestation, which is where most of the carbon credits have been generated from to date with regard to terrestrial carbon sinks. Increased sequestration is more than avoiding deforestation. Singapore and the region is a focus of attention when it comes to nature-based carbon sinks. Southeast Asia is relatively rich in nature-based carbon sinks. Singapore, as a source of finance, has obviously got an interest in those carbon sinks and those elsewhere in the world. The tropics is a particular focus for increased carbon sequestration through these nature-based carbon sinks, partly because of the high levels of productivity and therefore high levels of carbon capture. But as I've already mentioned, these nature-based carbon sinks also provide a range of other ecosystem services in addition to carbon sequestration, such as food, water, biodiversity conservation, etc., etc. And this balancing of multifunctionality is a real issue, a real challenge that often gets overlooked in carbon projects. So Southeast Asia is rich in nature-based carbon sinks, but unfortunately, many of those carbon sinks are actually currently sources of carbon emissions as a result of degradation, deforestation, and the like. So deforestation has proceeded at pace in our region over the last 2 decades or so. That deforestation has tended to shift over that time to higher elevations because most of the lowland forest has been cleared and converted to plantations. Of course, deforestation at higher elevations incurs problems such as catchment degradation, soil erosion, etc., etc. But also, a large amount of emissions have come from degradation of peatlands and conversion of our mangroves to shrimp farms and the like. Of course, important economic activities. And in fact, when we look at our region as a whole, we have particularly high intensity of emissions from land cover relative to the area. So Southeast Asia accounts for about 5% of the global land area. It accounts for about 30% of global land use emissions. That's a terrible record to have, but it also offers some hope in terms of increasing sequestration. If only we can get our act together, we can improve the carbon capture potential of these degraded and deforested areas. So the scope for enhanced carbon sequestration through restoration and protection in our area. Of course, one way of funding that, as we're talking about, is carbon markets, an important way of funding through carbon offsets and the like. And much of the attention, as we've seen today as well, when it comes to carbon markets and how carbon credits might be created, is based on a project level discussion. So we talk about carbon sequestration projects, and technologies such as MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification of carbon sequestration additionality. Much less attention is paid to these more governance related issues, such as second order climate justice. What happens to local communities when these carbon offset projects are implemented, for example? Leakage we've talked about, so having small projects may protect carbon in one small area, but if we don't deal with the causes, say, of deforestation, that deforestation just pops up somewhere else, get the leakage of carbon. And also the durability of any carbon credits generated. Ignoring these features, these governance realities, leads to this legitimacy gap. Basically, that's a gap between what the aim of a project might be and its actual benefits within the context of broader sustainable development aims. And so, for example, as mentioned, in our region and in other regions as well, these nature-based carbon sinks have multiple functions. They're often lived in. People use them for fishing, use them for other economic activities. And they're also often interconnected. So those interconnections may be social, biological, hydrological, biochemically, etc., etc. So looking at our region, this is an area of Sumatra, where we have mangrove forests adjacent to peat swamp forests with connections between the two. Those connections are rarely considered when we come to projects that are aimed at carbon sequestration. We will have a blue carbon project in a mangrove area and a peatland project in a peatland area. So governance, these broader governance concerns, are relatively understudied globally, including, of course, in our region. And to be effective, governance needs to accommodate these realities, these social, environmental, ecological realities. It also needs to be adaptive. We're in a period of rapid environmental change. Project boundaries don't respect periods of rapid environmental change. We need a more flexible system, especially if we're reliant on these carbon credits being durable over the long term. So is there an appropriate scale of governance? Well, I would argue, and others have done recently too, is that there's a need to upscale, to look at larger geographical scales than simple projects. Projects might be easy to manage, but they're, in the long term, much more problematic. So one possibility is a more jurisdictional approach. So rather than an individual project, you think about the administrative boundaries of a district or a province or whatever. There's an eco-region approach which has been adopted in Europe. But there's also landscape-based approaches such as catchment-based approaches, which accommodate the more than carbon functions of nature-based carbon sinks. They accommodate this multifunctionality, the interconnectivity. They allow adaptation to change, but they also permit a predictive approach as well, because this is the same scale as climate change models, and so we can anticipate climate changes and their impact on these systems. They also allow for spatial planning, for separating out this multifunctionality in a more systematic way. So how might we fund it? Well, of course, carbon credits have to be part of the answer here, but also we should not rule out market-based sources of funding. Has already been pointed out today, most carbon credit schemes, most market-based schemes are dependent upon non-market-based sources of funding for their setting up, for their creation. They rely heavily on non-market-based sources of funding. But maybe there are other non-market-based sources as well. So in the Paris Agreement, non-market-based approaches are basically anything that doesn't involve carbon markets. So there's a broad toolkit to select from. Urban areas are responsible for about 70% of emissions. Perhaps we can do more, not through investing in carbon credits, but in other ways for funding conservation and protection of these really important ecosystems that have these multifunctionalities, including biodiversity conservation. So this brings me on to a small project that I've been involved in as part of this bigger carbon governance project that I lead, and that's been looking at the willingness of urban populations to actually pay directly, not through carbon credits, but pay directly for the protection and conservation of important nature-based carbon sinks in our region. So we've been running this revealed preference experiment. It's got a few more months to run, but I can just give you some of the preliminary results of that experiment. So basically, we've been surveying individuals in Singapore and in KL, Malaysia. We've surveyed about 500 or so individuals. That survey is taking place in 3 waves. We've just completed the first wave, 2 more to complete before that should be July 2024 to February 2025. Sorry about that. So basically, these participants are interviewed. They're asked various questions. They respond to various questions. They're then given a sum of money, and they're given a range of choices, completely free to them, how to spend that money. You want to spend it on, you want to put it in the bank, do you want to spend it on groceries, or do you want to invest it, or will you invest it in a nature-based carbon protection system? And so the preliminary results here very quickly. Majority of people were interested in protecting the environment. Majority saw themselves and government as being responsible for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The vast majority had not participated in any form of climate action, however, despite being interested in the environment, concerned about climate change. Again, the majority of people thought that they would benefit directly through projects such as mangrove rehabilitation and restoration. But when it came to donating the money that we'd given them to projects which were involved in various types of restoration, conservation and the like in our region, there's quite a difference in the results when we compare Singapore at the top here with Malaysia lower down below. So this is not a project, incidentally, where we wanted to compare Singapore with Malaysia, but what we're trying to do is test whether urban populations really would spend their money protecting the environment in rural areas, and not necessarily rural areas in their own country, but rural areas overseas. And this is just the first phase. The majority of people in KL, the vast majority, in fact, people in KL donated some or all of their money. In Singapore, we're a bit more skeptical, and the vast majority, well, the majority in Singapore spent it on other things, stuck it in the bank or spent it on groceries or whatever. As we run through this project, what we want to do is provide the participants with information about carbon sinks and determine whether receiving that information from trusted sources has an impact on their behavior, has an impact on their willingness to pay for conservation, pay directly, without going through carbon markets. So this is the bigger project. This QR code doesn't allow you to ask questions. That takes you to the website for the project, incidentally. So this is the bigger project. It's funded by the Social Science Research Council here in Singapore, a big grant, multi-institutional, universities from around the region, including NTU, NUS, of course, as well, and also universities in Europe. That's my summary. I don't need to read that out. I think I'm over. Thank you. Thank you very much.